What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode is Marvin Barth, founder of Thematic Markets and former Chief Economist for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury, who previously served at the Federal Reserve and the Bank of International Settlements and has led global macro and FX strategy on both the sell side and buy side. Marvin and I spend the first hour of this conversation unpacking his thematic framework, including his concepts of localization, being is believing, and global entropy, and how these thematic frameworks can help us understand changes in growth, inflation expectations, interest rates, the underperformance of emerging markets, the limits of monetary policy, and the weakening of American soft and hard power. The second hour turns to geopolitics as we explore Marvin's three pillars of Western primacy: mythology, economic dominance, and military superiority, why he believes each of these have already peaked, and how rivals to America's post-World War II liberal order have used asymmetric methods of warfare to thwart the West's dominance and are now in a position to offer something radically different, a new sociopolitical and economic model that can rival Western capitalism and democracy. We also explore scenarios ranging from a rapid dissolution of the global system to the managed emergence of a new bipolar order with two sets of economic and political ideologies, supply networks, and technological standards. This includes a broad discussion about portfolio construction for this new regime, including the role of the dollar, and how the broad international adoption of stablecoins could prove to be one of the most consequential stories of the coming decade. If you want access to all of this conversation, go to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, discounted access to third-party research and analysis, and in-person events like our intimate dinners and weekend retreats, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. Lastly, because this conversation deals with investing, nothing we say on this podcast can or should be viewed as financial advice. All opinions expressed by me and my guests are solely our own opinions and should not be relied upon as the basis for financial decisions. And with that, please enjoy this expansive and deeply thought-provoking conversation with my guest, Marvin Barth. Marvin Barth, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you, Demetri, and pleasure to be here.
I was almost going to say welcome back, but you haven't been on the show before, but you have been to one of our Genius dinners in London, our most recent one. So you and I have had some time to get to know each other and for me to learn about your work and your approach and the way that you think. But the audience doesn't, so I'm excited to sit down with you today and apply your framework to the world. And there's a lot that we share in common, which is also kind of scary. I always worry a little bit when I talk to somebody that I agree with too much, because then I worry that I'm going to get into a thought bubble. But before we get into any of this, Marvin, just tell me a little bit about you. What's your story? What's your background? How did you become interested in markets and geopolitics?
Yeah, well, first, let me say thank you for inviting me to that dinner. That was a really great experience. I really enjoyed that. You bring together an amazing network of people that definitely do break outside of the thought bubble, I think. So I appreciate that. In terms of my background, I was raised in a military family, mostly grew up in the Central Valley of California, and I went to UC Berkeley and studied economics by accident. I wanted to study everything under the sun, and Berkeley had this really interesting undergraduate program that you could get a degree in economics with only 4 upper division courses. And so I was able to study everything else and basically do a liberal arts major, but graduate with this supposed degree in economics. And, I'll spare you the long story about how I ended up pursuing a PhD, but it was another one of these sort of path-dependent things. And I got a PhD in economics, went to the Fed. I was, despite the fact that I had focused on domestic monetary policy, was put in the international division, covering emerging markets, thrown in the hot seat right in the middle of the Asian crisis back in the late 1990s, covering Southeast Asia. Moved on from there to look at global financial markets in a position where I was briefing the board on what were the international developments once a month. And it was just this great experience to not only be there, be the sort of first line of defense for that, but also like I was working with the most senior people in the Fed who had years more experience than me. So they were telling me about, oh yeah, do you remember the dollar crisis of 1978? Things like this, And I just sort of absorbed all this economic history from the people who were there dealing with the problem at the time. And what I would say was a big formative experience was being able to translate that myself. My first sort of job outside the Fed was I went to markets and I came to London, was working for Citi, and I had to come up with a global currency view. And I think this is really core to the way I think. Trained as an economist, I think in sort of general equilibrium terms, right? So I think about how all the pieces fit together. That's just naturally the way I've thought. And being able to draw on all that I learned at the Fed, and they'd sent me away for a year to the Bank for International Settlement, so I got to see how other central banks and other institutions thought about the world as well. I was able to, and forced to by my job, sort of think about how everything fit together, because I've always thought of foreign exchange as the market that clears all other markets. So the only way you can possibly understand what's going on with the dollar or things like that is you literally have to understand every other asset market, and you have to understand the politics, the geopolitics, the technological trends. And that's really where I started to develop this sort of thematic basis. I later went back to Washington, worked at the US Treasury, where I was the chief economist for international affairs. And again, this was really thinking about the big picture geopolitics. It also gave me an experience of working at an explicitly political institution. So, the Fed, especially under Alan Greenspan, was actually quite apolitical. And, that's not the role of Treasury. Treasury is to advance the agenda of the president. So it's a very political organization. And to see how politics actually worked and sort of absorb that into my framework. And, I've been back to markets in other forms on both the sell side and the buy side, but it's been continuously refining this general equilibrium view that there are major themes out there that ultimately drive the things we're seeing. And sometimes those themes go unobserved for a while. People don't recognize what's going on. Sometimes they make up names for them because they don't understand what's going on. I would differentiate that. That's a narrative, right? But it's really about looking through across all the pieces and figuring out what are the underlying dynamics that are driving the phenomenon that we are seeing, rather than focusing on sort of the specific news event or what you might call the proximate cause of a move inside. So I suspect we'll put some meat on the bones in terms of what I'm talking about in our discussion, but I'd say that's where my philosophy comes from, if that helps explain it.
Sure. And the way that you talk about, those are the themes that you're talking about there. And the way that you talk about themes is the way that I have often talked about forces. In fact, I have literally said, what are the underlying forces driving the epiphenomena that we experience in the world?
Exactly.
And you're not the only one either. By the way, Tim O'Reilly, who had been on the show in the early days, has a similar way of talking about what he would describe as the vectors, the sort of origin points from which the epiphenomena are impacted. And the deeper you go down the vector, the better you understand the underlying force. So your Substack is called Thematic Markets. I think maybe the best place to start here, Marvin, in terms of helping people understand how you view the world, is to understand what you mean exactly by taking a thematic approach to understanding markets. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to do that is to illustrate that with a specific example in terms of one of the themes that I think has been one of the crucial ones. And it's one where I've been quite different from most of the rest of markets for the last several years. And I would identify as crucial to my out of consensus calls being accurate. And that's this one about what I call localization. So, there's a lot of people talk about deglobalization or things like that. And that's what I mean about a narrative. Deglobalization is, we observe that trade is not growing with GDP in the same way that it was before, or that, there are barriers to trade going up or things like that. And we're going to call that this deglobalization phenomenon. Localization is something very different. It is actually what's driving that process. And I think it's a very underappreciated and underobserved phenomenon. So to explain it, let me take you back for a second and explain a little bit of economic history. David Ricardo, 200 years ago, pointed out that trade was beneficial because different countries had different comparative advantages in terms of their economic geography, what was there in terms of like pasture lands versus, river networks for trade and things like that, and different skills of labor. And so we've known about the benefits of trade for at least 200 years. Why did we not have significant globalization until really it took off in the mid-1980s? There was a period in the Victorian age as well, but when we talk about globalization, it's really about the mid-1980s it really starts to take off. And what that was all about, in my view, was not tariffs, because tariffs had been falling since the first GATT, a General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, back in 1947. What it was technology. You couldn't manage the complex supply chains you needed for these globalized supply chains unless you had the advent of personal computers and software that allowed multinational companies to coordinate and track and have extremely complex supply chains. And so that's what really drove globalization. It was technology.
What about the counter-argument that the first era of globalization that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century happened before the personal computer, before the microchip?
Yeah. So, the Victorian period is a great example of that. But then think about what you were talking about in terms of what was happening with global trade. Most of the trade that you were seeing was trade in commodities and finished products. You didn't have the type of globalization that we had post-1980, where you have all the different intricate intermediate parts going back and forth between each country to create a final product. I think that's
wonderful,
fantastic
explanation.
The big difference, right? And of course, that's one of the reasons why, if you look at productivity per person, it's so much higher now than it was in that Victorian age of globalization, where you weren't fully able to take advantage of total specialization of labor. That was really about economic geography, taking advantage of economic geography, not the specialization of labor. And that, by the way, is a great transition, Demetri, in terms of that's what starts to change, is that in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we start to get the advent of early artificial intelligence, increasing abilities of robotics, to the point where you can increasingly substitute capital for labor. Now, once that happens, there's no more reason why you need to trade with other nations other than that you don't have those resources in your country, right? So if the machines are doing all the intermediate steps, why wouldn't you just locate those machines where your rich customers are in rich countries, not dispersed across the world where they're subject to trade disruptions, or frankly, the fact that labor are a lot less reliable than machines, to be perfectly frank.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, localization is not just a function of growing geopolitical risks and the breakdown of the unipolar order or the rules-based liberal order, but it's also a function of technology and technological
I would say it is primarily a function of that. And I would say this is one of those, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head. I'm sure you probably have some good ones that you'll think of how things happen because their time is right. Like, I guess maybe a good example is the emancipation of women and women's rights. That didn't happen really until we got the technological advancement of birth control, right? It's not that those ideas hadn't existed before. It's that the technology enabled it.
Well, I mean, also the same thing, you could say the same thing about the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War would not have happened if the North had not become industrialized.
Yes, exactly. So this is exactly what I'm saying. So it's the technological break that is enabling localization that also actually facilitates, like, we'll probably get to this in more depth, but I would say, Donald Trump, to the extent that his push and what he's trying to do is going to be successful, is entirely a function of coming at the right time in terms of the ability to actually reindustrialize the US through localization. But the key point is that localization starts more than a decade ago. And you can see this in the change in global investment patterns, the change in import penetration, all of these things. The US fundamentally changes its economic model beginning in 2012. It steps up and accelerates in the first administration. Then you hit COVID, really it does it. And I would argue we're going to go through a third stage of acceleration right now because of the second Trump term.
So I just want to throw in a caveat, and maybe we can explore it later. I'm hesitant to give Trump much credit when it comes to localization, not because what he's doing isn't necessarily consistent with that, but also the economy of North Korea is localized. And I'd like to dig into this a bit later because I do think this is a point of departure between the two of us. I do not see in Trump's policies a sensical approach to what you describe as localization or friendshoring or nearshoring or onshoring. I don't see a president or an executive branch or a White House that's doing an effective job incentivizing the rebuilding of American domestic manufacturing, because it seems that and my primary critique is that Trump's policy, besides being just focused on tariffs, because that seems to be the big one, it's also so erratic that I feel like it bears other costs that are ultimately counterproductive to that specific objective. But we'll have a chance to talk about that. Before we do, just do me a favor. What is the difference between a theme and a narrative?
Okay, so if we take the localization example, I've given you an example of how this is happening. There is a technological cause that is driving this, right? Deglobalization is a description of what's happening. That's a narrative. Or you might think about, one of my favorite examples is secular stagnation. I ask you, what is secular stagnation other than a way to describe that growth was lower than people expected, right? It's a narrative, but there's no causation behind it. It's just, I don't know how to explain this, so I'm going to give it a name.
So secular stagnation was Larry
Summers.
Larry Summers' phrase. And didn't it describe long-run forces that were leading to underperformance of growth? Wasn't the idea that the causal forces were secular and not cyclical?
So he related them to that. So he said, we've got demographic decline, we've got, a lack of productivity growth. All of those things lead to this or are consistent with it. But he didn't have a clear causal framework as far as I could find. And in fact, I think, there were very clear explanations for why something else was really driving what he was talking about. So obviously, demographics is part of the situation, but I think, if you ignore the fact that China was pursuing and continues to pursue a policy of overinvestment to develop itself and to undermine its adversaries, that naturally brings down the return on capital in the rest of the world, then you're missing a key part of the story there, right?
That seems like it would also be a good explanation, maybe even a better explanation for the narrative of the Great Moderation.
Which one?
Specifically China's role, because what's interesting is what was not really discussed in the late 90s and I think more, and in the early 2000s where Greenspan raised his conundrum about long-term interest rates not responding to the Fed's raising the Fed funds rate, was this lack of a geopolitical framing. Although I suppose there was some talk about excess savings on the part of Chinese bringing down interest rates in the United States. But to your point, I'm simply trying to say that this explanatory framework is an interesting way of, I think, explaining what was at the time a huge narrative, which was the Great Moderation, that central banks around the world were bringing interest rates down. And the way it was discussed to the layman was thinking, oh, it's because central banks are bringing interest rates down. And as opposed to there were other causal forces driving a lower cost of capital.
And I think that's a critical point to understand why central banks have lost, control of inflation at this point.
Because they never had control of it to begin with.
Exactly. And this, by the way, if we go back, I'm sorry to answer one of your previous questions. One of the things that's sort of a defining characteristic of my research is a great skepticism that economists know as much as they think they would know. I would argue very clearly economists do not understand inflation well and have continuously gotten it wrong, and they're continuing to get it wrong.
If a theme becomes a narrative, in other words, if the underlying structural drivers of the epiphenomena become widely understood, what does that suggest about the remaining lifespan of that theme's relevancy?
Well, I think this is why I focus on themes versus narratives, is that the theme is a causal mechanism. So, there's always this issue of endogeneity, right? Or what, I always have to laugh, what George Soros calls reflexivity. He acts like this is some sort of new concept that only he thought of. But obviously, when people become aware of it, it helps change the behavior. But just because you're aware of it doesn't change the underlying phenomenon itself, right? If technological change, if we now have increased capacity to build production chains in our own countries rather than having outsourced supply, and you still have to build all that capital to do that. If everyone all of a sudden today agreed with me and said, oh yeah, Marvin's really hit upon this is all about localization, that may change to some extent how it's priced in markets, right? But it's not going to change the phenomenon. We still have to go through that process, which means you're still going to have the demand for capital, which is going to still put pressure on real interest rates. Does that answer your question?
It does. And so a few more questions about themes and the symptomology around themes before we get into the three pillars of Western power, which for me is the most interesting part of this conversation. So let's stick first with localization and discuss some of the symptoms that arise from localization, for example, like higher long-term rates or stickiness in inflation during the early stages of this cycle. And then let's get into some of the other themes that you've identified. So localization first. What knock-on effects does localization, which we have broadly been thinking of in Western societies as deglobalization, what's the primary symptomology of that in markets?
Look, so there are some really important things that come out of this. So I mentioned that there were a lot of big calls I had in markets that were quite out of consensus that have turned out to be spectacularly right. So, when I first started writing about localization, I was writing about it in terms of emerging markets. The first piece I wrote on this was called Rethinking Emerging Markets. And the key point was that if you look at the growth of emerging markets, most of it actually came from globalization. That is, that you had Western companies coming in, not only bringing capital to build factories in these countries, but also, more importantly, bringing technology and know-how, right? And so the interesting thing is that if you break down growth in emerging markets into sort of the three components of what's called the solo growth model of how economic growth happens. You can either add more workers, you can add more capital, or you can add more technological know-how or process know-how, so-called total factor productivity. If you look at the 1950s and 60s and most of the 70s, emerging markets actually had almost zero per capita income growth. All their aggregate growth was population growth because they weren't very good at adding capital and they had very little total factor productivity growth. Once globalization starts to happen, you have foreign capital coming in, so capital is going up. And most importantly, total factor productivity shoots up because you're bringing all these Western techniques with you. Well, guess what? Since 2012, when I said was the sort of turning point in globalization for the US, emerging markets have consistently underperformed the West, and especially underperformed the US. Right? And if you look at their total factor productivity data, it's because they aren't having total factor productivity anymore. Right? So this is a really big point. The second big point I'd think is that you built all this capital in other countries, right? You shifted all your factories out of the Midwest, out of Germany, out of, Northern England, to emerging markets all over the world. Now you're trying to localize. Well, guess what? You have to rebuild capital again. That means you have to increase demand for capital. Savings is relatively fixed, and in particular, this is where that demographic factor comes in. It's actually restraining savings. Well, real interest rates are the intersection of savings and investment. So if investment goes up and savings ain't, guess what has to happen to real interest rates? So one of my big calls was in the middle of the last decade. I said, this is in 2015, 2016. I said real interest rates have bottomed out. And other than COVID, I was right? They've been going up since. And that was also crucial to my thinking about why inflation and rates were going to go up so much more after COVID. Because the issue was, by that point, you had almost a decade of firm experience with this idea of localization. But a lot of firms, as you know, they're not going to make a big investment decision like that unless they're forced to. Well, COVID was basically the starting gun to say, you'd better do this because your supply chains are not secure. And so you got a huge demand surge as well as that investment surge. So it was a real interest rate phenomenon, put upward pressure on real interest rate, but it also created the inflation because you got a supply shock, a demand shock, and an expectation shock all at once. The expectation shock is related to a different theme, what I call being is believing effects, but we can talk about that later if you like. But does that give you a good set of examples of how a theme translates into very clear, direct market implications?
It does, actually. That was excellent. So actually, I think this is a good time to talk about the being is believing. So what is that theme, and how does it relate to what you were just talking about?
So being is believing is just, my sort of more intuitive name for expectations, the expectations hypothesis in economics. So one of the things that when I said economists don't really understand inflation, I think from a theoretical perspective, we actually do have the seeds of that understanding in there. It's just most economists ignore it because it's really hard to measure something like expectations. Yes, we have some expectations measures in the US, but they're not great. They don't translate directly, and it's more an art than a science. But the key point about being is believing is that if people believe something, it can happen all by itself. So one example many of your listeners might be familiar with is Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, right? And he talks about how myths are responsible for societies developing and building things. And he even relates myths directly to money. Why do we accept these dollar bills or pound notes or renminbi? Because we believe other people will. And so once that belief takes hold, it happens. It alters reality. And this is the critical missing element of inflation, I think, is that, what happened is that the Fed finally convinced people, and other central banks followed along when they adopted FATE, which, as you know, this last weekend they unwound. FATE being the flexible average inflation target, and saying, hey, we're going to purposely run inflation hot to make up for bad and low inflation in the past. Everybody said, oh my gosh, I think they're serious about this. I'm going to expect more inflation. And then when you get hit with both a coincident demand and supply shock, those beliefs are fulfilled and they become increasingly self-fulfilling, which is why the Fed is having such a difficult time getting inflation back down. So that's a good example of being is believing. It applies mostly to inflation. I would give you one more example where it's critically important, and it's again another inflation example, which is think about what a hyperinflation is. A hyperinflation is the belief that people might not take that money from you. So if you think about what a dollar bill is relative to a Treasury note, the difference between the dollar bill and the Treasury note, they're both issued by the US government. They're both backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. One has a coupon and a fixed maturity date, right? The other has no maturity associated with it and pays no coupon with it.
And people are forced to accept it also.
Well, yes. So you do have that. But remember, even in economies that have hyperinflation, you're forced to accept it. But the key point is you don't think other people will, right? And that's where the being is believing comes in. This is what generates a hyperinflation, is that if I think that everybody will accept this, that dollar bill is a zero maturity instrument. It may not pay interest, but it's zero maturity because I can always convert it into goods at any time I want. The second I think people might not accept it, it becomes an infinite maturity instrument. Now, what is the price of an infinite maturity bond that pays no interest? It's zero, right? That is a hyperinflation. That's why hyperinflation is entirely about beliefs. And you just have to convince people that the government is going to be secure on its financing versus not. That's the whole game in a hyperinflation.
So I'm going to skip ahead here to talk about myths in a bit more detail. But before I do, I just want to give people a basic structure of your three pillars before we get into mythology specifically, which is one of the pillars. So you highlight three pillars of Western power in your work. One of them is mythology, the other is economic dominance, and the last is military superiority. And you assert that all three peaked in relative terms between 1991 and 2003. Before you walk me through your argument and flesh out each of these pillars, let's talk about the myth of the post-World War II order. And I'm going to quote from one of your papers here. You wrote, quote, "A central pillar to my thesis is that an important contributor to global entropy and its future pace is a mistaken belief by the West that its sociopolitical myths are internationally shared. As a result, the West over-relies on myth to maintain the post-World War II liberal order and is blind to others' antipathy to the myths it promotes, particularly its conception of universal human rights. The gap between the West's perceptions and reality provides an opening for its adversaries to exploit in tearing down that order." So this really resonated with me. Walk me through your argument here. Can you elaborate on this, please?
Yeah, so let's start with, how do you create a political order, or in this case, a geopolitical order? You need, I would argue, three elements, which are those three pillars that you mentioned. Let's start with the ones that are probably most important in the development of political orders in humanity. At some point, some brute uses his power to force everybody else to go along with him. So you got to actually have power in terms of military power to force people to go along with you. Okay? Now, in order to build a significant or a bigger tribe where you can force more people under your control, you're going to need economic power. You're going to need to be able to effectively cajole or incentivize your power structure with economic means, and at some point buy weapons, things like that. So you need economic power. And then the third one is ultimately every single society does this. They create some sort of myth that explains why. So, of course, the divine right of kings is the obvious one. I rule because God said I should, right? Every single political entity has those three elements in it. And so what happened in the wake of World War II was that the US, mostly with its Western allies, but also with sort of semi-participation of the Soviet Union, decided to create a new international order to help it restrain peace and promote commerce, which, go back to what Calvin Coolidge said about the U.S., the business of America is business. promoting commerce around the world. Well, we've got American power to support this. We've got American economic might because the U.S. economy was not only the largest economy, but the only one with a, whole capital stock at that point. And we need some sort of animating myth behind this that, we have the rights of man, these same values that we have instituted in the United States. And remember, one of its key partners was the United Kingdom, which shares most of these values. And they instituted these. If you read the UN Charter, it very much reads like it comes straight out of, Western Enlightenment thought. And that was fine as long as the US and the West continued to have economic and military power. What I would argue is that those started to fall by the wayside in the last few decades, and the US, and not just the US, Europe did this as well, the West in general, actually increasingly relied on the myth part without understanding that actually most of the rest of the world never accepted the myth in the first place. So I think that's what is critical to this theme of what I've called global entropy. That is, that the established geopolitical order is naturally dissolving of its own accord, but also because of Western mistakes and reliance on this myth part.
Okay, let's really dig into this because I find this resonates with me. So talk to me more about the drivers of the disintegration of the global order. Tell me more of a story here to help me understand what the key moments were, the key events, what caused people, both in the US and within the countries, the nation states that are part of this order, to begin to lose faith in that order and in the stories that were being told to promote it.
Okay, so let me start in chronological order with, in my mind, how they start to fall apart. And I just said that not everybody really accepted the myth that the U.S. and its Western allies imposed after World War II.
I mean, this is absolutely true, including the Brits. The Brits weren't fully on board with it. The French weren't. I mean, the reality is that this alliance, this Cold War alliance among European and Western states was always a tenuous one, but it existed because of the force of the USSR and the threat that it imposed.
That was U.S. power. It was access to U.S. markets. But I think there was, to the U.S.'s credit, because the U.S. had been perceived as being such a good actor in some sense. And also there was just this sense of, well, gosh, how did you become so successful? You must be doing something right. That there was at least an open-mindedness to accept that, well, maybe these values you're talking about are okay. But I think that myth was definitely pierced starting in the 1990s. So I would say the high point, the point where people were most willing to believe that maybe there was something to these Western, supposedly universal values, the point at which they become, I think, hit their apex is the Gulf War in 1990. I mean, if you recall, the U.S. was able to corral most of the rest of the world. And it was also in an environment where its main intellectual or ideological competitor, the Soviet Union, had just fallen. So everybody says, well, gosh, these guys must have the winning formula, right? But from there, what happens is the West really begins to abuse these things. And I know a lot of people focus on the Gulf War II, the Iraq War. But I would say it goes back before that. I would say it was really the Clinton administration. In fact, in many ways, the Clinton administration was sort of the pinnacle of this, even though they didn't get involved in the Iraq War. Madeleine Albright, I think, summed it up best. I can't remember the exact quote, but she basically said, we can intervene in Kosovo because we're America. We are the indispensable nation. We're right because we intervene. Now, think about the arrogance of that statement. That is unbelievable. There's no myth behind that other than, hey, we are right, you are wrong, that's why we're doing it. And I think that's when people start to really question this idea that the West has its way. And then, of course, the Iraq War only solidifies that. Then you get the global financial crisis, which says, gosh, these guys can't even do finance. This is the one thing that I thought that they could do really well. right? So that's when the myth starts to erode. And if you don't mind, I'll come back to that point, because how US adversaries have taken advantage of that is really, really important. But let's go next to the economic power aspect of this. One of the aspects of US foreign policy over the Cold War was to promote security arrangements by effectively buying off its allies, saying, hey, look, we'll give you great trade terms and cement you into this, and we'll send our companies over and help you out. And you can say that this was all about American profiteering, and there was certainly a whole aspect of that. But if you go back and look at the trade deals that the US negotiated, they were explicitly advantageous to the other countries, not to the US, right? Over and over and over again. And it was US security is going to be enhanced if we buy this off. But of course, there's a cost to every one of those. Every time you do that, you are ceding sort of industrial ground to other countries that often were using industrial policies. If you go back to your earlier question, Demetri, about how the global savings glut really even starts to before China becomes this overpowering force in it. And it really was about the global savings glut from Japan, from emerging markets, all doing the same thing in terms of using US financial markets and repressed savings in their own country to reindustrialize or further industrialize themselves. And if you go through several decades of that, at some point, actually the rest of the world is a lot more economically powerful than they were before, and you're less of a force. And the real turning point for that was the admission of China to the WTO. And this is like a perfect example of the US being so arrogant and thinking, we will never be challenged economically. And it's worth it to us to pay in economic policy to diffuse potential tensions. And so they effectively bought off China by saying, look, you don't have to open your capital account. You don't have to open your banking sector. You don't have to allow whole ownership of any of your companies. You can continue to have significant tariff walls against most of our goods. You can continue to pay subsidies, but we're going to give you almost entirely open access to our markets, right? And China used it to great effect. They used the Japan model of, repressed savings channeled back through their state-owned banks into investment in strategic industries. They felt better than anyone has ever done it, at a scale no one has ever done it. And as a result, within 30 years, China is, certainly in pecuniary terms, the second largest economy in the world. If you think about its production of goods, or what people often refer to as purchasing power parity terms, China's the biggest economy in the world. And all of this, by the way, has its roots, and I'll get to the military power in a second, back in that Gulf War that was sort of the pinnacle of American power. Because China saw in that war that a army that looked exactly like theirs, had the exact same Soviet tanks, had the exact same artillery, had the exact same aircraft, and was almost as big as their military, was eviscerated in 10 hours. 10 hours, was completely destroyed and was a burning wreck on the so-called highway of death. And they said, wow, we've been thinking all this time in strategic terms that the massive size of our military would be a deterrent to any other country intervening in our affairs. But what we can now see is, one, the US will use its myth to go around and intervene in other people's affairs. And two, they have so much military power through technology that they can and they will defeat us. So that was the genesis of their move to accelerate their economic development and accelerate their adoption of technological progress. And then, of course, it comes to military power. Ultimately, that's the third pillar. My good friend David Kilcullen, whom you've had on your program before, he dates the sort of peak of American military power to the first night of the Iraq War and the failure of the U.S. to decapitate the state in a coup de main strike on Saddam Hussein. And the key point is that from there, what happened was the U.S. was bringing all these fancy weapons and technology that had developed to fight the Soviet Union into this counterinsurgency. And the insurgents basically learned, look, never stand in clear ground or in a place where the U.S. can attack you because nobody can match their firepower. So always try and attack obliquely or asymmetrically. And that's what an insurgency was all about. And, you know, he writes wonderfully about all the different little innovations they took in terms of like off-the-shelf products, using Apple iPads for artillery targeting and things like that in ways that nobody had ever done before. But the key point is that in the background, countries like China were looking and seeing, this is the way you fight the US. You don't fight them directly. You fight them indirectly, whether it's through economic warfare, whether it's through information warfare, or ultimately, you'd better design, if you have to use military technology, you'd better design weapons that give you asymmetric power. And so there was, you know, a focus on anti-satellite weapons, on hypersonics, on anti-aircraft batteries.
Anti-access area denial. I mean, the Chinese have developed and deployed what I think is broadly agreed on to be the largest and most advanced land-based missile capability, especially in hypersonic weapons and regional anti-access area denial systems. And the PLA has deployed those very deliberately across the Taiwan Strait and the first island chain to deter and prevent the United States and its allies from interfering in any potential conflict over Taiwan. Can I just say that I love that you brought up David Kilcullen. His most recent book, The Dragons and the Snakes, How the Rest Learned to Fight the West, from which I think you borrowed that term, Dragons, is an excellent book that I recommend everyone read. He's also written Out of the Mountains, The Coming Age of the Urban Guerrilla, and The Accidental Guerrilla, which is, I think, the book that really put him on the map. He was on the podcast back in early 2020, right as the COVID lockdowns were about to hit in the US, and I cannot recommend that episode enough. It was one of my favorites. I also want to recommend Chris Brose's book, Kill Chain. Chris has also been on the podcast. He's the president and chief strategy officer at Anduril, the defense company started by Palmer Luckey. And he goes into quite a bit of detail in that book about how American domination of Iraqi airspace and the public unveiling of what became known as networked warfare, as well as the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade nearly a decade later, were interpreted by the CCP as shots across the bow and inaugurated a new era of unrestricted warfare against the West until such time as China felt it no longer really needed to hide and bide, which I think brings us to where we are today. Marvin, let's move the rest of this conversation to the second hour, including a further discussion about unrestricted warfare and how this informal alliance of antagonists to the post-World War II order learned to fight the West, and eventually, in the case of China, began to offer something different, a different type of political and economic model that actually challenges Western capitalism and democracy. And then we can end with a conversation about investment strategies for this new paradigm that can help us mitigate the risks associated with either what you describe as a complexity cascade that may result from a rapid dissolution of the order, or a new bipolar order with two different sets of supply networks and technological standards. And this will be a great opportunity to pick your brain about stable coins as well, and dollar dominance, which I know you're very bullish on, and it's an area where I think you and I share quite a bit in common. I want listeners to know that I've made some important improvements to our intelligence reports. You'll now find a glossary section in each of our reports that expound on all the various terms that we use in the course of these 2-hour-long conversations, some of which you may not be familiar with or could benefit from learning more about, along with what are effectively cliff notes with episode overviews, key points, and lessons to take away from these discussions that can help you make both more efficient use of your time when going through this episode and all of these episodes, and help you dive deeper into the material that we cover. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Marvin, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers get access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Marvin, stick around. We're going to move the second hour of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.